rosse bandiere, o proletari alla riscossa, bandiera rossa trionferà. Bandiera rossa deve trionfar, bandiera rossa deve trionfar, bandiera rossa deve trionfar, e viva il comunismo e la libertà, avanti il popolo alla riscossa, bandiera rossa, bandiera rossa.
Just a brief introduction to John. I think John is well known to most of us, but you know, the email he has the term wildcat. John has been active in the labor movement, in the trade unions, often in dissent and in a wildcat action against the union bureaucracy, has served as a Marxist in the labor movement and worked for some time. I don't want to use the term too many decades, but I mean, that's the truth. And now has done some quite in-depth work on the question of the contradiction between capitalism and nature, and particularly now the contradictions that have arisen because of the virus-19 crisis in which we're in. John, would you like to go ahead?
Sure. Maybe you want to mute all the mics during this, if they're not already.
I've already done that, John.
Okay, thank you.
And sorry to cut across, but hopefully people know that you can indicate if you want to come into the discussion by clicking on participants, and at the bottom it will show a raised hand where you can indicate that you want to come in. And that's after John, you've spoken. But everyone is muted now, John. Go ahead.
Okay. So hold on just one second. I just want to do this. Okay. So comrades, in today's New York Times, that bard of neoliberal capitalism, Thomas Friedman, wrote about how Trump cannot defeat, quote, Mother Nature, which, as he explained, quote, is entirely made up of chemistry, biology, and physics. And is in its own half-hearted and semi-conscious way, it's a reminder of what Frederick Engels wrote. He wrote, "We by no means rule over nature like a conqueror over a foreign people, like someone standing outside nature, but we with flesh, blood, and brain belong to nature and exist in its midst." And over the last 15 years or so, we saw developing in a general way the clash between capitalist development and the laws of nature, of the natural world, through the development of global climate change. But people could in the main, only feel that impact indirectly. And at the same time, what was developing under the skin, so to speak, was the rise of new zoonotic diseases. And that term, zoonotic disease, meaning one that jumps jumps the barrier from another species to the human species, is a new one for me, and it will be for most workers, but I think it should become commonplace in the working class. And it's true that most infectious human diseases are zoonotic, but in recent decades, the process of zoonosis has been vastly accelerated and intensified. We're seeing the opening of a new era in world history and a crisis based on this new era. And if we, meaning the working class and socialists within the working class, don't understand the nature of this new era, we will not be equipped to deal with it. The dawn of the last century also saw the rise of a new era. That was the era of the crisis of imperialist domination. Of course, that domination still exists. But in that situation, the working class was caught flat-footed, as was the socialist movement within the working class. And the working class was punished for this by the resulting 2 world wars and the rise of fascism. Now, though, the nature of this crisis differs from all other crises under capitalism. Unlike economic and political crises, which arise from the laws of motion of capitalism itself, this crisis arises from the clash between capitalist development and the laws of nature, the natural world. And if we don't start from that basis, if we only deal with the inequities, the injustices, and even the immediate struggles of workers under this crisis, then we are only dealing with the effects, not the cause, with the symptoms, not the disease. Rob Wallace, in his book, Big Farms Make Big Flu, castigates the scientists for only dealing with the, quote, science behind zoonoses. He explains that we cannot understand Ebola, for example, without understanding not only the changes in land use that drove it, but also which economic and political players were behind those changes. In other words, it's impossible to really understand the disease without understanding the political forces that opened the door to its rise. This is exactly the failing of most scientists, but socialists also have the mirror image of that failing. They all too often only deal with the politics and economics without dealing with the science. In other words, the scientists deal with the science but not the politics and economics, and many, if not most socialists, deal with the politics and economics but not the science. Neither is capable of really understanding or explaining the issue, and therefore is incapable of proposing the long-term solutions. Now, Wallace is trained in studying how viruses and other pathogens, that is to say germs, evolve, how they change. But his approach differs from almost all the rest of his peers in that he says that scientists can get bogged down in a blizzard of details and lose track of the greater context. What were the conditions under which the virus, for example, evolved in this particular way? What's necessary is to see the circumstances in which such a virus is not only likely to develop, but in which such development is inevitable over the longer term. This is important because, as he explained, once a new pathogen, for example, SARS-CoV-2, which is the virus that causes COVID-19, once a new pathogen is discovered, it's already too late. The virus is already out there in the environment. It's like closing the barn door after the horses have escaped, so to speak. Now, in order to understand COVID-19, we have to place it in the context of the rise of a whole series of new zoonotic diseases, SARS, MERS, swine flu, aviary flu, and a whole host of others. And there are two conditions that have opened the door to regular zoonoses. On the one hand, we have wild habitat destruction, which is usually due to land development for megatourism, logging, or agriculture factory farming development. This disturbs the wild species, often forcing them to come into closer contact with both humans and also domesticated animals. In addition, we have the rise of factory farming. This means raising meat animals, packed cheek by jowl, hundreds, maybe thousands, all packed in together. Not only are they packed together, they're also genetically nearly identical. So once a pathogen, often a virus, can get a foothold in one of these animals, it can spread like wildfire. The whole process is accelerated by the fact that the animals are slaughtered at an ever earlier age. So that puts pressure on the virus to evolve in such a way as to be able to be passed on ever more easily. In other words, to be ever more easily transmitted. Now, maybe the great majority of the virus mutations do nothing. Maybe the great majority can't be transmitted from the animals to another species or from another species to humans. And maybe they do little or no harm to the host. It doesn't matter if it's only 1 out of 100 or 1 out of 1,000,000 that can. In this situation, it's like a forest dried out by a years-long drought and where there are no fire breaks in the forest, and in a region where there are regular lightning strikes. Sooner or later, one lightning strike will set off the conflagration. Now, one detail, two species that are often mentioned in this dynamic, bats and hogs. The reason is that bats have a very powerful immune system and therefore are hosts to an unusually large number of viruses. And as far as hogs, the reason they are often involved is that apparently their immune system is similar to humans. So a virus that can overcome their immune system is likely to be able to overcome ours too. An example of this process was a renewed outbreak of Ebola a couple of years ago in Guinea. There, several companies, including a British-backed one called Farmland of Guinea Limited, obtained 99-year leases on, quote, underused agricultural land, as the World Bank calls wild habitat in Africa, among other things for the purpose of growing palm oil for trees, rather of growing palm oil trees. As well, factory hog farms were also set up in the region. And this disturbed the natural roosting place of fruit bats, which started to settle in the areas around humans and also around those factory farms. And they would drop their partially eaten fruit where the hogs were, and the hogs picked it up and ate it together with the saliva from the bats, which contained a virus that evolved into this Makona strain of Ebola virus. Wallace gives example after example. For instance, there was the swine flu outbreak of the 1990s, renamed H1N1 because the hog industry objected to the original name. Wallace explained that it was passed back and forth from birds to hogs and back again. So in one sense, it should be called the swine bird flu. But Wallace says that it would be more accurate to call it the NAFTA flu. He explains that NAFTA drove small hog farmers out of business in Mexico, and the large factory farms, first and foremost Smithfield farms, took over. And incidentally, part of the reason that these factory farms outcompeted the small farms was due to the US government support of factory farming here in the United States. In any case, Wallace gives the evidence that a virus evolved among hogs in those factory farms around Veracruz that was able to jump the species barrier to humans. Now, there are a few scientists who have studied and explained the role of habitat destruction in the rise of these new zoonotic diseases. One of the things that distinguishes Wallace is that he's the only one who names the companies and the individuals that are driving the process. As a result of the failure of others to do this, the other scientific writers end up, in effect, blaming the victims. Oh, it's these people in Africa or Indonesia who are encroaching on wild land, is their implication. Now, in the case of SARS-CoV-2, Wallace's view seems to be evolving. This is a new virus, and it takes a lot of detective work to figure out where and exactly how this virus evolved. A few weeks back, he seemed to be saying that the virus seems to have evolved in the wet market in Hunan, but more recently, he seems to be saying that there was a region in Guangdong province, some distance from Hunan, that might have also originally been involved. In any case, that a part of the evolution of this virus seems to have happened there in Guangdong. Now, the fact that it has genetic material from different animals makes it highly unlikely that it was developed in a lab and escaped either by accident or intentionally, either in China, as Trump claims, or here in the US, as that lunatic conspiracy theorist Judy Mikovits claims. There are dozens of other examples, as well as other aspects of the science involved that really need discussing, and I hope we do discuss them in the future. But for reasons of time, I want to pass on to some other political aspects, starting with the response of the capitalist class and their strategists. On the one side, we have the more insane wing, as represented here in the US by Trump and the Wall Street Journal. Their view is to open up everything and allow the disease to rip through society unchecked, after which we will acquire herd immunity, meaning that enough people will have had the disease and be immune that it won't really spread easily. We see the disastrous effects of this in, for example, Guayaquil, Ecuador, where there have been so many deaths that people were simply dumping the bodies of their loved ones out on the street, where they piled up like so much uncollected garbage. Completely aside from the massive suffering, though, there is no guarantee that herd immunity is even possible. That's because we don't know if once a person has had the disease, they become immune, and if they do, for how long they are immune. So we also need a clear look at the representatives of the more sane wing of the capitalist class. Here in the US, they are best represented by Anthony Fauci and the governor of the state of New York, Andrew Cuomo. And Cuomo was on TV every morning with his press briefings, and he's an extremely talented and intelligent capitalist politician. His talent lies in the fact that he's actually able to make statistics interesting, and he stands in stark contrast to Trump in this. Cuomo's extreme popularity shows how many millions there are that are really yearning for a politics based on science, reason, and even solidarity. But he too has a fundamental weakness. And it's the same weakness as FDR had. Franklin Delano Roosevelt's reforms were incapable of ending capitalism's most serious economic crisis to date. It took an immense human disaster, the rise of fascism in World War II, to accomplish that. Similarly, Cuomo and that wing of the capitalist class strategists he represents want to lessen the impact of COVID-19, but they totally obscure the cause, which is capitalism's clash with its looting of nature through factory farming and habitat destruction. In essence, what Cuomo and his wing represents is that school of thought known as eco-modernism. That is the view that all society's problems can be resolved by ever more modern technology. They basically advocate that, contrary to what Engels wrote, yes, we do stand above and apart from nature and can overcome the laws of nature. In the case of COVID-19, all that's needed is better social distancing, wearing masks, and vaccines. In other words, some degree of social regulation and technology. The popular scientist Anthony Fauci is also in that wing, as is Bill Gates. Then there are the different public organizations themselves, foremost among them being the World Health Organization. Trump recently cut off US funding for WHO in an appeal to his nationalist base, but we should not have any illusions in them. Wallace eviscerates these groups, including WHO, mercilessly. He describes a conference he attended when he was still in that crowd, including WHO. He describes how some of the scientists there were getting millions from the food giant Cargill. He describes something similar for One Health, that wing of the US Centers for Disease Control. And also for another major NGO, Eco Health Alliance, which is tied in with Colgate-Palmolive, which apparently is responsible for habitat destruction through its palm plantations for producing palm oil. Now, there's a lot more to discuss, including some of the more wild conspiracy theories, which are gaining a following of millions. And it's only through developing a thorough scientific understanding of COVID-19 that these theories can really be combated. But I'd like to conclude with a couple points on program and perspective. And it's clear that there's no wing of the capitalist class that can provide a solution. And of course, we have to support and help build those protests and the workers' movement in general. We have to raise a program that advances workers' power on the job, the power of workers to set and enforce the safety conditions they feel are necessary, and also in the community. While we have to do that, we also have to explain that fighting for this is not enough, that capitalism is creating the conditions for new and ever more devastating zoonotic diseases, and what those conditions are: factory farming and habitat destruction. I think that there are a lot of related issues that we also have to find a way to raise. One is the alternative to factory farming, which is regenerative farming. And that's something that I do believe we have to discuss further. I think as far as some of the specifics on a program, I think that part of the program should be for linking up the urban working class, especially maybe the urban working class youth, with the rural workers and small farmers, and also for direct links between workers throughout the world, and for direct links between agricultural workers and small farmers throughout the world. And of course, all of this aims at the dire necessity for the working class to play an independent role, starting with the building of a mass working class party, one that is born in struggle, that will develop out of an effort to coordinate and further the struggle of millions of workers themselves. Comrades, this is not the first zoonotic disease to threaten us, nor will it be the last. And I'd like to, Rob Wallace wrote, quote, Hendra, Ebola, malaria, SARS, STR-TB, QB fever, simian foamy virus, Nipah, and influenza. One of these bugs, or an as yet undiscovered cousin, will likely kill a few 100 million of us someday. It isn't if, as many scientists say, it's when. And comrades, I opened with that column of Thomas Friedman, and the problem with his comment is that while he's dimly aware of where he and his class are heading us all for, like an engineer on a runaway freight train, they are incapable of reversing course. And along with this disastrous pandemic comes also an opportunity. The viewpoint of the capitalist class is that humans live outside of and apart from the natural world. Nature is simply there to be dominated and exploited at will, just as is our labor power. That is the meaning of the World Bank calling the wild savannas of Africa underused agricultural land. Now, this pandemic is reminding us that we are not separated from the natural world. This is starting to force workers to look at the natural world in an entirely new way. We, as socialists and as Marxists, must take advantage of that opportunity to encourage this different worldview. First and foremost, we must do that by leading the way in changing how we ourselves look at this planet which we inhabit. Thank you.
Thanks, John. Look, I'm struggling a little because for some reason my laptop is frozen, and you know, I'm on my cell phone. I think I might have to ask Dave to take over the chairing, mainly because I can't see on the cell phone, you know, the hands raised. But could I just say before passing on to Dave, you know, please, John, that was a very inspiring talk, which dealt with the very broadest of theoretical issues, as well as the specifics of how we organize as a within the working class. And thank you very much for that lead off. We look forward to quite a lively discussion. Dave, could I ask you to take over and recognize the hands being raised?
Okay, thanks, David. At the moment, I don't see any hands raised, so maybe that's a technology issue. But whilst we're waiting, John, can I put a point to you? In your online article, which I read before the meeting, you talk about socialists not recognising these sorts of issues, and they're almost exclusively concentrating on working class struggle. I don't necessarily agree with you on that point. I think increasingly the socialist movement is to the fore on recognising that issues like climate change are exceedingly important. But you're talking about the laws of nature, but you've talked about, if I may say, sort of narrowly about zoonotic diseases, but you haven't mentioned climate change at all. And that's about the laws of nature as well. So if you're looking to a different sort of analysis, why aren't you tying that into it at the same time? It seems like you're too narrowly focused. It's an important issue, but it's unlikely that these diseases will just sort of rip through the human population without any restriction, because we have the ability to take steps, as we have done, to try and mitigate those effects. Whereas once the climate changes irreversibly, we reach that tipping point, the ice caps melt, it exposes, instead of being reflective ice caps, you're going to have this brown mass, which will give off methane gas, which is far more potent than CO2. And that situation is going to lead to an utter disaster. So that's my question.
Should I reply?
I would reply because I'm not seeing it.
Just before reply, could we see the other indications, just so that maybe we can get 2 or 3?
No, it comes up.
It comes up at the top, and you haven't got the top there.
Okay.
There's one other participant, Sean. Sean, would you like to come in?
Hi, yes, I'm Sean. I'm here in Northern California, like John. John, I think you raised a lot of important points. I would like to hear more from you or other comrades, just about how do we, and I think this is something we face when we talk about climate and the environment as well. So I think, Dave, you brought up an important point. Like, how do we talk about these things in a way that's still focused on them as like a class issue and a systemic issue, rather than either coming off as trying to divert like a biological problem into a political axe to grind? Like, how do we like successfully make the case that a pandemic is a kind of systemic issue that the working class has to solve? I mean, I guess that's a question about rhetoric or emphasis, but I would just like to hear yours or other comrades' thoughts on that. Thanks.
Okay, I still see no other hands. John, so do you want to come back and then see if that urges other people into the discussion?
Okay. Well, first of all, I think that my introduction already went on too long. And so...
Raise my hand, just saying.
Okay, well, should I wait for Julia then to comment?
There are people who are physically raising their hands. They're putting their hands up in the picture rather than clicking on the list.
Okay, I'll look out for that. Do you want to take some more questions first then, John?
Whatever you prefer. Maybe I would just suggest to people maybe to send a note to Dave Buxton that they want to speak, if you know how to use the chat window.
Take 2. Get him to take 2.
All right, take the 2 points that have been raised, myself and Sean, and then I'll look out for the people with their hands up as well as the chat as well. Okay, John.
What happened? Is anyone there?
You're muted, Dave. You're muted.
Unmute. Speak.
John, can you unmute yourself?
I do think that, okay, did you hear what I said up until then?
No.
No.
Okay. I said that, first of all, in relation to climate change, I do think that socialists were a little bit late to the party, even with that, in that while the threat of it was quite clear for over a decade, that socialists only started dealing with it after millions of young people started taking it up. And I do think also that there's a danger in underestimating this extremely serious threat of zoonotic disease. For instance, I mentioned Nipah virus. Now that virus kills something between 40 to 75% of the people that it infects. And the only reason that it has not become a mass crisis is that, that it's not very easily transmitted. But that's the whole point of what Rob Wallace writes, that all the pressure is on these viruses to evolve, to mutate in such a way that they become ever more easily transmitted. So can you imagine what the effects would be if Nipah virus or a virus similar to that were transmitted as easily as is the virus for COVID-19? So I think that we really must not underestimate the extreme danger that, that these issues pose. And as I said, the fact that or as Rob Wallace points out, the fact that once these viruses are discovered, it's already too late. Now, as far as, and I'm not underestimating the question of climate change, but in fact, the two dangers go hand in hand and they tend to reinforce each other. Now, as far as how we raise the issues within the working class and how we can relate them to the actual existing consciousness and the actual existing struggle of workers, I mean, I think we're all fairly new at that. And I'm not sure exactly how. I think that in part, just for instance, at different worker events where workers, for instance, where healthcare workers are campaigning to get full personal protective equipment from their hospitals, that if you can speak at an event like that, that of course you have to support and fight for such campaigns, but also just to open the door to say, but look, that's not enough. And we, as people who deal with the health of the members of our community, have to also start dealing with the causes of these crises and just explain it in a general way and exactly what are concrete steps. I mean, I think that there are some concrete ones here in the United States, including ending the farm bills. But I think that is something that we'll just have to develop as we go along, especially if we struggle to raise the issues in the first place.
Okay, thank you, John. The next, Julia is the next contributor.
You
I did.
No, we didn't.
Okay, there's a technical issue. I don't seem to be able to unmute. So Julia, if you could do it yourself, please. That's it. Oh, no, it went off. Try again, please. That's it. No, it's you unmuted and then that's it. No, it's. Try speaking. Right. Julia, try speaking now. Right, Julia, we're going to leave you for the minute and we'll pass on to Trish. Trish?
Hi. First of all, I will say Marcus was before me. He had his hand up quite a long time ago. But if I roll Marcus, as long as it comes to you. And I think we're getting feedback maybe from David from your iPhone. Your iPhone seems to, or someone's phone is causing lots of feedback here, so we might need it to be muted because it's either John's or David's. It's been there since before I put mine on. So it's either John Ryman, great to hear you, or David's iPhone. Any chance we could have those muted? That might help. That's made a bit of difference, David's iPhone. John, so maybe it's, I don't know, maybe it's coming from my laptop. Are other people getting loads of feedback? You are, yeah. So somebody, what about you, Dave Buxton? Is it yours?
I don't
know, somebody, hang on, it nearly went there. Dave Buxton, it's yours. I don't know why, but when you turned yours to mute, we no longer have got all that feedback. I'm sorry, I'm being like, but it's just
no. It's a good point. I'm going to change machines then, so I'm going to go offline for a minute. But you carry on. Yeah,
it's definitely you. Cheers, Dave. Lovely. Okay, so my point, and I wanted to come back to something Sean said as well, about how we make sort of issues around the zoonotic condition, diseases and viruses, and also climate change, how we make it a socialist issue. I think it naturally is. My opinion, and it's a bit maybe berserk, but you know, the fact is landowners have always had the power. The original power was land. Before money, it was land. And they decided what we eat and how we ate it. They decided what grew, what was livestock, and they still do. It's still McDonald's, it's still big business that kills the Amazon. It's still cattle that gets grazed, and then all of our, I don't know, soya that gets fed to cattle. You know, the elephant in the room here is the socialist movement needs to be joining with the other movement that's happening and been happening and rumbling since the 70s, probably 60s, a bit earlier for some real outriders. But, you know, the fact is 60s, 70s, vegetarianism and veganism, we need to be saying that we're not prepared to get involved with landowners' decisions about what lives, what dies. They decide that, for instance, children who fight with their dogs on estates are psychotic, but if they're in red jackets and getting blooded having killed a fox, they're just fine. It's I feel that they're integrally linked. I don't see how they're not linked. Global change and the way we're dealing with animals is an indicator of ownership. The rich and the wealthy, the class war, own animals, and they've decided that we need to eat them. They lied to us about milk. They've lied to us about all sorts of things like B12. They've lied to us about what we need to eat because they want to sell it to us because they own it. And owning animals, it's just like owning people. It's just we need to stop engaging with their system. And one of the biggest systems is that we can join with is to stop eating meat. And that really bloody hurts them hard. Thank you. Sorry.
Did you say Marcus was next, Trish?
Sorry, I had put my hand up, but I'm at work.
Go ahead, Julia. Go ahead.
Okay. Hello, everyone. I'm at work right now. I'm a frontline worker, and I work at the shelter in Los Angeles that was set up for COVID-19. I just wanted to respond to a question that someone had raised about how do we make this a class demand? And one of the things that I think about that, and kind of particularly what I'm involved in with a website called leftvoice.org, is linking the struggle with essential workers and frontline workers. Because a lot, on the one hand, these are people who are currently working. This is mostly the working class. A lot of Black and Latino people in particular are forced to work and are at work. At the same time, those workers are also in, like, either they're healthcare workers or they're also precarious workers in like fast food industry or Amazon or different places like that. And that's also where a lot of the strikes and things that have happened before are focused on. And another part is that a lot of essential workers, particularly nurses, are viewed by the general public as heroes and fighters. And the people who are fighting them are a lot of them right-wing people, some of them armed. And so to me, the fight for healthier work conditions and also workers' control, particularly over healthcare, but nationalizing healthcare under workers' control, but also the demands of the farm workers in particular, and people who make the food and grow the food and pick the food, that those people are the ones that are in charge of the food rather than it being privately owned. I think that those are some of the ways in which we can unite, fight in class struggle with this fight against the virus. And also the people who are being, who are having to work, many of them, particularly in the United States, Black, Latino, immigrant people, those people are also being targeted by right-wing fascists, vigilantes, and police. And so linking those struggles together, to me, is like a natural kind of link between that and what's happening with the virus. I may have to go while this discussion is happening because, like I said, I'm at work. But I really appreciate John's presentation, and I hope that, John, you'll make that available or publish it as an article, because I think you had a lot of good contributions between like agribusiness and how the pollution of the earth is leading to these viruses. So.
Okay, thanks for that. Jim Christie.
Thanks very much, John. I thought that was an absolutely excellent presentation in conjunction with the pamphlet that you produced on it. A question first on some scientific background, and then just a couple of comments, because I think you're absolutely right that the socialists, we have to get the science right. And it's just looking back over history, we had the disastrous plagues in Europe, well, worldwide. And particularly, of course, of the Black Death in the 1340s. And then for 300 years afterwards, you had a whole series of plagues in England. The last major one, I think, was 1665. And then it seemed to have died out. I'm not quite exactly sure why. And what I'm wondering is whether we're in a kind of historical parallel repeating itself, where we're going to get a whole series of similar ones of the zoonotic plagues. And picking up the theme you made about imperialism in the First World War, it was, of course, Rosa Luxemburg and others who postulated socialism or barbarism. And it seems to me that we have exactly that in face of us now. And in the COVID-19 scenario, which has hit internationally in all aspects of society, I saw one comment a person made that it's climate change on fast forward. Is that happens absolutely immediately. Climate change will happen over a longer period, but climate change will be even more catastrophic than the zoonotic diseases. These diseases may kill hundreds of thousands, maybe millions, but climate change actually threatens the existence of humanity on the planet itself, and so on. I don't see it being an either or between climate change or zoonotic diseases. It seems to me that they are absolutely linked, and other people have made exactly the same points. And in other discussions as well, I think the focus we have to have on these things is not just of us as consumers, but also in terms of the workplace. And it strikes me that the one thing that we need to tease it out. I'm sure you're absolutely right in teasing out the program. But it's of sustainable jobs. It's the economic one which is sustainable both in energy and in food. And so we need a more detailed one. But these things are linked, and they are linked actually to the fundamental issues that other comrades have raised in this discussion of the socialist organization of society. But I think we are coming back to Rosa Luxemburg's socialism or barbarism.
Thank you, Jim. Marcus? Is Marcus still there? Okay, after Marcus, it's Karen Ryman.
Okay, I think I'm here. Am I there? Can you hear me? Can anybody hear me? Okay, then I'm going to start talking even though I don't hear anybody else. First of all, I don't know, in case anybody's wondering about the last name, I am John's sister. One of the things about this whole, what John is talking about in climate change and these diseases, it's all about food production. And Trish was saying this also, food production is going to have to change. And I'm very, very interested in how we are going to do that, how we can get the urban populations and, like what other people have already said, connected with the rural populations. That people take over some responsibility for producing their own food. That means smaller gardens, people directly involved in growing. Yeah, basically that's what I'd like to see some discussion on that. How do we do that? How do we take over responsibility for producing our own food, getting it out of these big corporations and doing it ourselves? That seems to me to be the only way to do it. You can start, there's all sorts of things you can do. Buy a local farmers market, then becomes an economic issue. So it's all linked. But if someone could talk about that a little bit, that would interest me. Thank you. Now, this is my first time here. Do I have to get rid of the hand? I'm done. Wait.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Karen. Joan Collins, please.
Were you calling on me? Dave, were you calling on me?
Yes.
Okay. First of all, in response to Julia, I hope she's still here. And yeah, I didn't have time to really comment on the struggles of workers here in the United States. There's now been over 200 strikes and protests by various workers here. It really is a movement that's developing right underneath our noses, that many, many people are not sufficiently aware of. And I think that the main thing that we have to bring to these struggles is the call to unite those movements, those protests, into one nationally coordinated movement. And as part of that, I think that also would be linked to the issue of building a mass working class party. That's how such a party would develop, I think, is through these kinds of struggles and through uniting them. And then if you raise that, then you also have to raise how a working class party will deal with these issues politically. And that opens the door to this whole question. As I said, it's not something that exactly is in the forefront of the consciousness of the overwhelming majority of workers. And so therefore, it's not going to be just like falling off a log, raising these things, that we're going to have to struggle with it. And at times we'll raise it in ways that don't really get an echo. And then we'll have to go back and think about what's a better way to raise it. But struggle to raise it, we must do, I think. Now, as far as the question of the plagues of like the Black Death and so on, as I understand it, those plagues arose with the urbanization, mass urbanization of human beings. And now what we're seeing is the urbanization of animals, of meat animals. And so there is a similarity there. And I agree that the issue of climate change, that is not either or. But, you know, there's that old parable, which I don't know if it's really true or not, but it explains something about if you put a frog in water and slowly heat up the water, it won't realize what's happening until it's too late. But if you put a frog in boiling water, it'll jump out immediately. I don't know if that's true about a frog, but there's something about that dynamic that does explain something about how people are responding to climate change, or how workers are responding to climate change as opposed to COVID-19, because we're suddenly and sharply in the boiling water as far as this pandemic. And so that opens the door to encouraging workers to think a little bit more consciously and a little bit more deeply about our society's relation to the natural world as a whole. As far as food production, I think that that's another side of things. You know, in the United States, and I'm guessing in other countries, there's all kinds of community-based movements to link up food district, to link up workers in the inner cities and in the cities with farmers as far as distributing food. And I think that that's a way of also linking up the urban and the rural working class and urban and rural youth. Finally, as far as vegetarianism, I mean, I myself, I've always said, if I had to kill everything I ate, that I would be a vegetarian. But we do have to look at the alternative to factory farming, which is regenerative farming. And in that form of farming, raising of meat animals does play an important role, because they're an important part of regenerating the soil. So anyway, that's just something that we should understand.
Okay. Joan Collins.
Hello?
Yeah, that's...
Yeah, hello. Can you hear me now, yeah?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, it's Dermot Conley here. John is just listening in. So, hi, John. That was very interesting. I haven't read your article, and I haven't heard of Bob Wallace, but I will follow it up now. I think the issues you raised are very, very linked to the question of climate change. And just as an aside on that, the COVID-19 has done more to lessen carbon emissions in 3 months than all the conferences in Paris and the United Nations and all have done over the last decade. And I think that gives strength to a point that we've raised in relation to climate change. It's the question of the introduction of a 4-day week without loss in pay, to reduce people traveling to work and so on. And the other key question is the question of free public transport, at least in major urban areas. That's a big question. Now, at the moment in Ireland, talks are taking place on the formation of a government after a general election in February. The Greens are looking to enter that government, and they've raised a target of a 7% yearly reduction in admissions, which is a very, very ambitious target. The two key elements in that in emissions are agriculture, particularly cattle breeding here in Ireland, and the question of transport. Now, because the Greens have raised these issues, we have a group of right-wing politicians who are trying to develop and push an urban-rural divide, saying that people in the cities don't care about agriculture, they don't care about rural Ireland, and so on, which is quite dangerous. Now, I'm like a lot of urban working class people. I know absolutely nothing about agriculture, and it's something that we have to really take on in the next period, about things like green farming, if you like. You know, we here in Ireland, we import and export enormous amounts of food, which is completely unnecessary. So, no, but as well, I think if we approach this from a very, I think theory is always important, so that we have a scientific basis to what we're doing. But I think the key question coming out of this is how we as socialists, working class activists, politicians, and trade unions, how we can intervene as people, as society starts to come out of this. One of the facts that has emerged here recently is that 1/3 of the workers who are receiving the COVID payment because they've been laid off are better off than when they were in work. In other words, 350 euros a week is more than they were earning before the crisis. A trend in all the European countries, and anyway, is that the deaths in care homes, nursing homes, and so on, has been the majority of deaths in this crisis. And it reflects the way these are run. They're run for profit, they're privatized, there's low pay, poor training, poor management, lack of PPE, protective equipment, and so on. And I think that these issues about low pay, precarious work, and so on, can come to the forefront as we come out of the crisis. And therefore, like we've been doing work, for example, construction has restarted in Ireland since last Monday. We're doing work in relation to that with the union that we're members of. We've put out a hotline for workers to contact the union if they feel the conditions they're working in aren't safe, there isn't the proper social distancing, protections, and so on. We're also trying to, with difficulty it has to be said, make inroads with fruit pickers here in Ireland. It's the fruit picking season. A lot of these workers are from Eastern Europe. We're trying to get in and talk to them. We've got translators in Bulgarian and Russian and so on. But it is difficulty. A lot of these workers regard trade unions, because they're coming from the former Stalinist states, as a scam, as just giving money to bureaucrats and so on. So those are, I think we have to still have a focus on these issues so that unions are seen as relevant to those tens of thousands of workers, particularly young workers, female workers, migrant workers, that are being brutally exploited, and then try and link these questions to the broader questions that have been discussed here. And I think it's very important. The Green Party in Ireland is a right-wing party, pro-capitalist party, but they have been able to recruit a large number of youth in the last 2 years. And we have to find ways to distinguish ourselves from the Greens in relation to climate change. And not in just simple things like socialism is the answer, or you can't solve it without tackling capitalism and so on. We've got to deal with it in a way that appeals to young people, that gets our ideas across in a way that they say are realistic and possible in the present situation. So I'll leave it at that for the time being. Thanks.
Thank you, Dermot. Very interesting contribution from Ireland. Ed Bober. Tough love, I see you, so I'll write your name down.
Sono i confini, rosse bandiere,